Working as a waitress at a Christmas party, the woman froze when she suddenly recognized the millionaire. He was her husband, the man she had thought was dead for the last 7 years. She slowly approached him, and the Parker household that evening was strangely quiet, save for the soft crackling of the fireplace and the faint sounds of carolers singing in the distance. The air was thick with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine, settling into every nook and cranny of their humble home. Allison adjusted the ornaments on their slightly crooked Christmas tree, her fingers brushing against a fragile angel figurine that Connor had insisted they hang the year before. The ornament, delicate and beautiful, seemed to echo the fragile sense of normalcy Allison had worked so hard to restore for her family. "Mom, does this go here?" Mia's small voice broke the silence, holding up a sparkling silver snowflake, her wide eyes filled with innocent curiosity. Allison turned toward her and smiled, though the warmth of her expression couldn't quite mask the exhaustion she felt. "That's perfect, sweetheart. Right at the top." Maya beamed, her cheeks rosy from the fire's warmth, and carefully hung the snowflake just below the tree's star. Meanwhile, Connor, now 9 and growing far too quickly, was sprawled on the couch, working on a half-completed puzzle. His furrowed brow showed his focus, though his attention was split between the puzzle and the conversation around him. "You always say that to Mia," he teased, shooting her a playful look. "She gets all the compliments." Allison chuckled and moved over to ruffle his messy brown hair. "That's because she has fantastic taste," she said, pausing for effect. "As for you," her eyes twinkled as she gave him a teasing grin. "Well, let's just say you're a work in progress." Connor rolled his eyes, but a small grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Thanks, Mom. Love you." "Love you too, buddy," Allison whispered, her heart swelling with a mixture of affection and a quiet ache. She gazed at her children, their faces lit by the soft twinkling lights of the tree, feeling an overwhelming wave of gratitude mixed with sorrow. They were her entire world, the only thing that kept her grounded when the weight of the past threatened to drown her. But no matter how warm the moment felt, the shadow of that loss still loomed just out of sight. Every Christmas carried that shadow, the absence of Tyler. 7 years had passed since the accident, but the pain still clung to her like an open wound that refused to heal. She could still recall the night the police knocked on her door, somber faces, carefully measured words, and the numbness that followed when they told her Tyler was gone. His car had been found wrecked on a dark, icy road. No survivors. Just like that, the life she knew was shattered beyond repair. "Mom!" Mia's soft hand tugged at her sleeve, pulling her back to the present. "Are you okay?" Allison blinked, her eyes stinging, and forced a smile as she bent down to hug her daughter, feeling Mia's small arms wrapped tightly around her neck. "I'm fine, honey. Just thinking about how lucky I am to have you too." Connor's expression softened as the playful glint faded from his eyes. "We're lucky to have you too, Mom. Right, Mia?" Mia nodded enthusiastically, her pigtails bouncing with the movement. "Yeah, we love you more than anything." Allison's throat tightened, and she pressed a kiss to Mia's cheek. "I love you both more than anything too." She straightened up, taking a deep breath, and forced herself to push the sorrow back into its corner. "Now who's ready for some hot chocolate?" A chorus of excited cheers rang out in response. The heaviness lifted from the room, if only for a brief moment. Allison moved toward the kitchen, retrieving mugs from the cabinet and heating milk on the stove. The soft clinking of spoons stirring marshmallows into the cocoa felt oddly comforting. This was their tradition, small, simple, and yet wholly theirs. "Don't forget the whipped cream," Connor called out, peering over the counter. "I wouldn't dream of it," Allison replied with a smile, generously topping each mug with a fluffy swirl of whipped cream before handing them off to the kids. They settled back onto the couch, faces glowing with contentment as they sipped their steaming drinks. Allison sank into the armchair by the fireplace, wrapping her fingers around her own mug. The dancing flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, and her gaze wandered to the mantel where framed photos stood like silent reminders of a life once lived. One photo was of Tyler holding a newborn Connor, his face radiating pride and joy. Another captured the 4 of them together, their last Christmas as a family. Allison's fingers traced the edge of the photo frame, and the familiar ache in her chest grew. She had never been able to take those photos down, even though sometimes, looking at them felt like pressing on a bruise. When the kids finally drifted off to sleep, Allison remained by the fire, the house wrapped in an almost sacred silence. The weight of the day pressed down on her and she wondered, once again, if she was doing enough for them. If she was enough. "You're stronger than you think," her sister Jill had once told her. "But you don't have to be strong all the time." But what choice did she have? Weakness wasn't an option when two little lives depended on her. As the clock inched closer to midnight, she stood and turned off the lights on the tree. The angel atop it glowed faintly in the dim light, a fragile symbol of hope. She whispered into the stillness, her voice quivering. "I hope I'm doing okay, Ty. I hope I'm making you proud." But deep down a darker question stirred within her. Why did it never feel like he was truly gone? The morning sun filtered gently through the thin curtains of the Parker home, casting a soft glow across the living room. The Christmas tree continued to sparkle with its colorful lights, and the faint aroma of pine and leftover cocoa lingered in the air. Allison stood by the kitchen sink, rinsing out the mugs from the night before, her thoughts swirling as she absent-mindedly watched the water spiral down the drain. The sound of the mail slot opening broke her concentration. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door, picking up a small stack of mail, bills, coupons, and an envelope from the kids' school. She sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. December always seemed to stretch her thin, both financially and emotionally, as she flipped through the envelopes. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, she found her neighbor and friend, Carla, standing there with a bright smile and a thermos in hand. "Morning, Allison. Thought you might need a coffee refill," Carla said, extending the thermos. "You're a lifesaver," Allison replied gratefully, accepting the warm container. "Come in for a minute." Carla stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the cozy but worn living room. "Tree looks great. The kids must be excited." "They are," Allison said, her smile faint. "They always are. I just wish." She trailed off, not finishing the thought. Wishing didn't pay the bills. Carla tilted her head sympathetically. "Something will come through." "It always does," she said, pausing before brightening. "Actually, that's why I stopped by. Do you remember my cousin Liz? The one who works catering at those fancy Beverly Hills events?" Allison nodded, curiosity piqued. "She called me last night. One of their regular clients needs extra help for a big Christmas gala tomorrow night. The pay's really good, and they're desperate for staff. I told her I'd ask if you'd be interested." Allison blinked, the weight on her chest lightening for just a moment. A job like that could mean getting the gifts Connor and Mia had been hinting at. Maybe even a little extra cushion for January's rent. "That sounds amazing," she said slowly, trying to keep her excitement in check. "Are you sure they'll take me on such short notice?" "They'll take anyone who can carry a tray and smile," Carla reassured her. "It's at some big shot's mansion. You'll be serving drinks or hors d'oeuvres. Nothing too difficult. The shift's long, but it's definitely worth it." Allison took a deep breath. "I'll do it. I'll let Liz know I'm in." Carla grinned. "I knew you'd say yes. I'll text her right now." She said to dress in black and show up at the Hilton on Wilshire tomorrow afternoon. They'll shuttle everyone to the venue. Allison's mind buzzed with a mixture of anxiety and relief. It had been years since she'd been involved in any high-end event, and the idea of stepping into a mansion filled with the wealthy made her stomach churn. But she couldn't afford to pass up this chance. "Thanks, Carla," she said softly. "I really appreciate it." "Anytime, hon." Carla gave her a quick hug. "Now go enjoy the rest of your day with those kids." After Carla left, Allison leaned against the door for a moment, the warmth of the thermos in her hands a small comfort. A flicker of hope stirred inside her, small but persistent. Maybe this was the break she needed, the light at the end of an endless tunnel. That afternoon, she took Connor and Mia to the park. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant chimney smoke. Connor raced ahead with a group of neighborhood kids, while Mia clung to Allison's hand, her eyes sparkling as they made their way toward the swings. "Push me, Mommy." Mia squealed as she scrambled onto the swing, her legs kicking excitedly. Allison smiled as she positioned herself behind Mia, giving the swing a gentle push. The sound of Mia's laughter was pure and uninhibited, a joyful sound that temporarily washed away the heaviness in Allison's chest. As Mia swung higher, her giggles blended with the rustling of the leaves, and Allison's thoughts drifted to Tyler. He used to take them to this very park on weekends, his deep laugh echoing as he chased Connor around the playground. Allison closed her eyes for a brief moment, breathing in the cold air and pushing the memories aside. "Higher, Mommy. I want to touch the sky," Mia called out. Allison laughed softly. "Okay, hold on tight." For those brief moments, everything felt almost normal. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, Allison stood in front of the small closet in her bedroom, pulling out a simple black dress, one of the few things she'd kept from before. It was modest but elegant, a reminder of a time when dressing up for a night out was part of her life. She ran her fingers over the fabric, her thoughts swirling with both anticipation and nervousness. Tomorrow night, she would step into a world that seemed a million miles away from her own. But she reminded herself why she was doing this, for Connor, for Mia, and for the chance to give them a Christmas they truly deserved. She hung the dress on the door and turned off the light. The faint glow of the street lamp outside cast shadows on the wall as she lay in bed. The quiet hum of the night settled around her, and a strange feeling fluttered in her chest, part hope, part dread. A quiet whisper in her mind told her that something was about to change. Whether it would be for better or worse, she didn't know. But she would face it, just as she had faced everything else, head-on with no other choice. The winter sun had already started to dip behind the skyline when Allison arrived at the Hilton on Wilshire Boulevard. A cold wind nipped at her cheeks as she adjusted her black dress and smoothed her hair into a neat bun. The lobby was filled with caterers, waitstaff, and event organizers, all dressed in black and white, their faces set in focused determination. "Allison Parker?" A woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard called out. Allison stepped forward, clutching her small purse tightly. "Yes, that's me." The woman gave her a quick once-over and nodded. "Good. You'll be assigned to drink service. Follow the group outside to the shuttles." Allison joined a small cluster of workers as they filed out the glass doors into the chilly evening. The van was already half full, the sound of quiet conversation mixing with the occasional burst of laughter. She slid into a seat by the window, her eyes fixed on the city lights flickering to life. "First time working one of these gigs?" a young man beside her asked, his voice friendly. She turned to find a warm smile on his face, his dark eyes kind and open. "Yeah, first time. You know I do this all the time. It's good money if you don't mind being on your feet all night, and the rich people pretending you're invisible," he chuckled. "I'm Marco, by the way." "Allison." "Well, Allison, don't worry. Stick with me and you'll be fine." She managed a small smile, grateful for his kindness. The van pulled away from the curb, rolling through the city, past twinkling holiday decorations and crowded sidewalks. The chatter in the van faded as they entered a wealthy neighborhood, where tall gates and perfectly trimmed hedges lined the streets, and the air seemed colder somehow. The van finally stopped in front of an imposing mansion. The house stood as a symphony of grandeur, tall windows framed by ivy, golden light spilling onto a circular driveway lined with luxury cars. A large wreath decorated with tiny white lights hung on the massive oak doors. "Showtime," Marco muttered as he stretched his arms. "Ready as I'll ever be," Allison replied, her stomach twisting with nerves. They climbed out of the van, the cold cutting through her thin dress. A sharply dressed man ushered them through a side entrance, away from the grandeur of the main doors. The hallway they entered was a sharp contrast to the world outside. Polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and an air of understated luxury. "All right, everyone," the event manager barked. "This is a high-profile crowd. No mistakes, no lingering, and absolutely no fraternizing with the guests." "Understood." A chorus of "Yes, ma'am" echoed around them. Allison took a steadying breath as she picked up her tray of champagne flutes. The glasses clinked softly, a delicate, nerve-wracking sound. She followed the other servers into the main hall, her eyes widening as the room revealed itself. The ballroom was breathtaking. Golden light sparkled from a massive chandelier above, casting warm hues across the glossy floor. Guests in designer gowns and sharp suits drifted through the space, laughter and conversation swirling like an elegant waltz. A live string quartet played in the corner, their music floating gently through the air. Allison felt like an outsider peering into a world that wasn't hers, the wealth, the glamour, the effortless smiles. It all seemed so far removed from her reality. But she forced herself to shake off the feeling, steadying her hands as she balanced the tray. Just keep moving, she whispered to herself. You're here for the money. That's it. She weaved through the crowd, offering drinks and dodging the occasional dismissive wave. Most of the guests barely glanced at her, their eyes sliding over her like she was part of the decor. She caught sight of Marco across the room, who gave her an encouraging thumbs up before disappearing behind a group of laughing socialites as she passed near the grand staircase. As she walked past a gilded mirror, she caught a glimpse of herself. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Black dress, tight bun, mask of calm professionalism. It all felt like a costume, barely concealing the anxiety bubbling just beneath the surface. Allison. She blinked, realizing the voice had come from inside her head. But the sensation of hearing her name in this setting sent a cold chill down her spine. She shook it off and turned toward the center of the room. Her gaze swept over the guests, and that's when she saw him. At first, it was just the back of a man in a sharp charcoal suit. His broad shoulders and dark hair were familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten. He stood near the fireplace, drink in hand, laughing at something someone had said. The sound of his laughter, deep, rich, unmistakable, sliced through her thoughts. Her breath caught in her throat. No, it can't be. The man turned slightly, his profile coming into view, and the tray in her hands trembled. The world around her seemed to blur, the chatter and music fading into a distant hum. Her knees felt weak, and for a brief moment, she thought she might drop the glasses. It was him. Tyler. Alive. A cold wave of disbelief crashed over her, and her heart began to pound so loudly she was certain the entire room could hear it. Her fingers gripped the tray tighter, knuckles white as she struggled to breathe. All the years of grief, the nights spent wondering, the crushing loneliness, it all hit her at once. He wasn't dead. He was here, alive and well in this world of wealth and privilege, smiling as though nothing had ever happened. A wave of sickness swept over her. Her mind screamed 1,000 questions, but only one rose to the surface, sharp, clear, and unforgiving. How could he do this to us? The air around her seemed to thin as her chest tightened. She stared at the man she once knew better than anyone, or so she had thought. Tyler's profile was etched in her memory. Every curve of his jaw, the slight crinkle around his eyes when he laughed. She had memorized those features in her grief, terrified that time would erase the image of him from her mind. And yet here he was in the flesh, alive, breathing, smiling. Her hands trembled. The tray of champagne flutes clinked softly in her grip. She clenched her jaw, forcing her legs to stay steady. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind, but none of them made sense. How is this possible? Why is he here? Why didn't he come back to us? Her heart pounded so fiercely that she could barely hear anything else. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to move forward, one step then another. The space between them narrowed, but it felt like an insurmountable chasm. She weaved through the crowd, her vision narrowing until Tyler was the only thing in focus. Her fingers tightened around the tray, the glass stems digging into her skin. As she drew closer, Tyler turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the room for a heartbeat. Then their eyes met. His laughter faltered mid-sentence, and his smile wavered. Confusion clouded his expression. Then recognition flashed across his face like a lightning strike. His eyes widened, and his body stiffened as if he'd seen a ghost. Allison, he breathed, his voice barely audible. He took a hesitant step toward her, his eyes darting around, as if expecting the floor to open up beneath him. What are you doing here? A sharp laugh escaped her lips, bitter, hollow. What am I doing here? She echoed, her voice trembling. I'm working. You know, surviving something I've had to do alone for the past 7 years. Tyler flinched, his face contorting with guilt. He glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. I can explain, he said urgently. Please, not here. Can we go somewhere private? I'll tell you everything. I promise. She shook her head, the sheer audacity of his request igniting a fire inside her. Private? You want to hide this conversation like you hid from us? Her voice rose, drawing curious glances from nearby guests, but she didn't care. The years of pain and confusion surged to the surface, refusing to be silenced any longer. Allison, please. His voice trembled, desperation flickering in his eyes as he reached for her. But she stepped back sharply, the action hitting her harder than any words ever could. She let the tray slip from her hands, setting it down with a soft clink on the nearest table. Her fists clenched at her sides, her entire body tight with anger and confusion. The shaking in her hands was gone now, replaced by a cold resolve that made her voice steady. "Who are you?" Her voice was low but every word cut deep. "Tyler." She shook her head slightly, staring at him with disbelief. "The man I married, the man I loved, wouldn't have done this. He wouldn't have abandoned me. He wouldn't have left our children." For a moment his face crumpled, and she caught a glimpse of the man she once knew. But it was fleeting. It disappeared as quickly as it came. He turned his head, his eyes searching the room, landing on a woman in a glittering red dress. The woman's expression tightened with something that looked like concern, and Allison's heart twisted painfully. She could barely breathe as she whispered, "Is she the reason you left? Is she the one who replaced us?" Tyler's silence answered her in a way that words never could. His jaw tightened, and that was enough. The betrayal was a physical blow. It felt like the wind had been knocked out of her. The man she had mourned for so long, he hadn't just left her. He had moved on. The tears she felt building in her eyes were quickly forced back. She wasn't going to cry in front of him. Not now. Not ever again. "You're a coward," she spat, the words sharp as a knife. "You didn't die, Tyler. You just ran away." "Allison, please." "No," she interrupted, holding up a hand to stop him. "Don't you dare say my name. Don't you dare ask for my forgiveness. Not after everything." She turned away, the pain in her chest almost unbearable as she walked away from him. Every step felt like she was tearing herself apart, but she had to leave. She had to get away from him, away from the lies. Her vision blurred as her emotions spun out of control, but she forced herself to focus. She had to escape. Pushing through the crowd, she found the side exit and stumbled into the cold night. The air slapped her face, but it didn't do anything to calm the storm inside her. She pressed a hand over her chest, trying to steady her breathing, but every inhale felt like it was tearing her apart. 7 years of grief. 7 years of unanswered questions. All of it, every single moment, had led to this gut-wrenching truth. The door creaked open behind her. "Allison, wait." Tyler's voice broke through the night air. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The world around her blurred, the twinkling holiday lights, the laughter echoing from inside the mansion. All of it felt like it was happening in another world. A world that was no longer hers. Her shoes crunched on the gravel, but she couldn't hear it. All she could hear were the sounds of Tyler's pleas in her mind, over and over, each one more hollow than the last. She wanted to run, to put as much distance between her and the lie she had just uncovered. She stopped, leaning against a tall hedge for support, the sharp edges of the leaves grounding her to reality. The night felt colder now, her breath visible in the air. She closed her eyes and inhaled, trying to calm the violent beating of her heart, but each breath felt like it was cutting through her chest. "Allison." Tyler's voice was frantic now, desperate. She squeezed her eyes shut harder, willing herself to disappear. But his footsteps grew louder. Before she could move, he was there, standing just a few feet away, his face illuminated by the faint light spilling from the mansion. He looked like a stranger to her now, the man she had once known, now wearing a mask of shame. "Allison, please," he rasped, his breath visible in the cold air. "I need you to listen." Her eyes snapped open, and she gave him a look that could cut through steel. "Why should I listen to you?" Her voice cracked, but she didn't let the tears fall. 7 years, Tyler. 7 years. I thought you were dead. I buried you. I cried for you. Our kids cried for you. And all the while you were out here living some new life. Her words were laced with anger, but the hurt was there too, sharp and raw. Tyler flinched like every word she spoke struck him. "It wasn't that simple," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Nothing's ever simple with you, is it?" She couldn't help herself. The words spilled out before she could stop them. "It's always too complicated for you to face, right? Running away is always the easiest option for you." He took a step forward, his hands outstretched in a gesture that once might have calmed her. "But not anymore. I didn't want this," he whispered. I thought I was protecting you, protecting all of you, from what was happening. Her bitter laugh was sharp and jagged. Protecting us? From what, Tyler? From the truth? From having a husband? From our kids having a father? Tyler looked away, the weight of his shame too much to bear. I got in over my head, he said, his voice almost inaudible. I was in deep with dangerous people. I made some bad choices, Allison. And when things went south, I thought the only way out was to disappear. I thought they'd come after you. After the kids. Her heart twisted, but she didn't let his words soften her. So instead of facing the consequences, you chose the coward's way out. You let us think you were dead. You let your children grow up without their father. He nodded slowly, his entire body sagging with the weight of his guilt. I thought I was doing the right thing, he muttered. But I was wrong. Yeah, damn right you were wrong, she snapped, her voice trembling with years of pain. Do you have any idea what you did to us? Connor barely remembers you. Mia asks me why her daddy isn't in heaven with the other angels. Do you know what that did to me? To them? I had to explain to a 5-year-old why life isn't fair, and I had to do it alone. Tyler's eyes shimmered with tears, but they didn't reach her. Not this time. I wanted to come back, he whispered, his voice fragile. But each year that passed, it got harder. I didn't know how to fix it. You can't fix it, she said, her voice cold and unwavering. Some things are beyond repair. A heavy silence hung between them, the world around them continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Who is she? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Her voice barely a whisper. The woman in the red dress. Is she part of this mess? Tyler's expression tightened. Her name is Ashley and she knows. Allison's jaw clenched. She knows that you abandoned your family and pretended to be dead. He nodded, his guilt written all over his face. She was part of it, he admitted. She helped me disappear. Allison's stomach turned, disgust flooding her system. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was a complete erasure of everything they had. He didn't just leave her, he replaced her. You didn't just leave us, Tyler, she whispered. You replaced us. It wasn't like that, he pleaded. It was about survival. Survival. Her voice rose, trembling with fury. I know all about survival, Tyler. I survived without you. We survived without you, she said, her voice low but firm. You don't get to use that word. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she angrily wiped it away, as if she could erase the pain that followed. He didn't deserve to see her cry. You should have stayed dead, she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of it. At least then we could have held on to the memory of who you were. Now all I see is a lie. He reached for her again, but she stepped back sharply, the distance between them growing impossibly wide. Go back to your party, Tyler. Go back to your new life. Her words were hard, final. Because you sure as hell aren't welcome in mine. With that, she turned on her heel, the cold air rushing into her lungs with each determined step. She heard his choked sob, but she didn't stop, didn't even glance back. She had 2 children waiting for her. They were the only truth she had left. The cold wind stung her cheeks as she hurried down the long winding driveway of the mansion. Her footsteps were quick and unsteady, propelled by a desperate need to escape, to distance herself from the painful reality she had just uncovered. Her mind replayed the confrontation with Tyler over and over, each word a jagged piece of the shattered puzzle, cutting deeper into her heart. Her breath came in sharp, ragged bursts as the glittering lights of the party blurred behind her, swallowed by the night. She didn't notice the few guests who threw curious glances her way as she passed. Her focus narrowed only on the iron gates ahead. If I can just get outside, maybe I can breathe again. Allison. The sound of Marco's voice cut through the chaos swirling in her mind. She paused, her fingers gripping the cold iron bars of the gate, the metal biting into her palms. She turned slowly, blinking through the haze of tears that threatened to spill over. Marco was jogging toward her, brows furrowed with concern, his breath visible in the chilly air. Hey, he said softly, his voice urgent but gentle. What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, but it was hollow. I have. Marco's eyes searched her face, clearly trying to make sense of the turmoil there. Do you need a ride home? You can't go back in there like this. She shook her head. The thought of returning to that mansion twisting her stomach in knots. No, I need to get out of here. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Come on, my car's parked down the street. She followed him through the gates, her feet numb as they crunched over the gravel. The street beyond was dark and empty, a stark contrast to the golden glow of the mansion behind her. Marco unlocked an old sedan, and she slipped into the passenger seat, the worn fabric of the seatbelt scraping against her skin as she settled in. The car was silent, the hum of the engine the only sound as Marco started it. He glanced over at her, his eyes cautious but kind. You okay? She let out a shaky breath, her voice barely audible. No. Not even close. He didn't press her for details and she was grateful for that. Instead he pulled onto the road, the headlights slicing through the dark. The city lights glittered in the distance, a blur of motion and life that felt foreign, out of reach. They drove in silence, the radio playing a soft jazz tune that seemed almost absurd in its calmness. Allison stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of Los Angeles pass by like a dream, her mind a whirlwind of questions and memories she couldn't untangle. Tyler was alive. The thought felt surreal, like a cruel fantasy. For years she had mourned him, believed that she had failed to protect their children from the reality of loss. She had grieved alone, cried in the dark when the kids were asleep, forcing herself to move forward because there was no other choice. But it had all been a lie. He hadn't died. He hadn't been taken from them. He had chosen to leave. A fresh wave of anger bubbled up inside her, hot and fierce, but beneath it, a knowing doubt began to fester. What if he was telling the truth? What if he had really been trying to protect them? Could there be a reason, any reason that could justify what he had done? She shook her head, trying to rid herself of the thought. No, there was no justification for abandoning his family, for letting them suffer while he built a new life with someone else. Where do you want me to drop you? Marco's voice broke through her thoughts, gentle but steady. Allison blinked, realizing they were close to her neighborhood. Here's fine, she muttered, pointing to the corner a block away from her house. He pulled over and put the car in park, glancing over at her one last time. You sure you're going to be okay? He asked, his voice filled with concern. She forced a tight smile, the exhaustion and emotions weighing on her. Yeah, thanks, Marco. For everything. He nodded, his eyes kind. Take care, Allison. She stepped out of the car, the cold air biting through the thin fabric of her dress. The familiar sight of her street offered a fleeting sense of comfort. The houses were quiet, their windows glowing softly with Christmas lights. She wrapped her arms around herself as she walked home, her thoughts a tangled mess. The porch light was on just as she had left it. She unlocked the door quietly, careful not to wake the kids. The warmth of the house wrapped around her like a fragile shield. She leaned against the door, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to hold it all together. Allison. Her sister's voice startled her. Allison's eyes flew open to see Jill standing in the hallway, her expression a mix of relief and worry. Hey, Allison whispered, forcing a weak smile. Sorry I'm late. Jill shook her head, her gaze softening. Don't worry about it. The kids are asleep. She paused, studying Allison's face. What happened? Allison's lips trembled, and for the first time since she had seen Tyler, the tears she had been holding back spilled over. Jill was by her side in an instant, wrapping her in a comforting hug. He's alive. Jill. Allison choked out the words, her voice barely a whisper. Tyler. He's alive. Jill froze, her arms tightening around Allison. What? Allison nodded, sobbing now as the dam finally broke. He's alive. And he left us. He lied. Jill's eyes blazed with fury. That son of a bitch. Allison's shoulders shook with the weight of it all. I don't know what to do. The kids. How am I supposed to tell them? Jill pulled back, gripping Allison's shoulders firmly. You don't have to figure it out tonight. Right now you need to rest. You need to breathe. Allison nodded weakly, the exhaustion crashing over her. Jill guided her to the couch, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Allison let herself fall apart, crying into her sister's shoulder. One thought haunted her as the tears flowed. What if the truth is worse than the lie? The couch beneath her was still warm, the faint scent of Jill's perfume lingering in the air. Her sister must have stayed with her through the night, holding her as she cried herself dry. Now the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that comes after a storm. She forced herself to sit up, her muscles sore and stiff. As soon as she did, the events of the previous night rushed back, crashing into her mind like jagged shards of glass. Tyler. Alive. The confrontation. The lies. The gut-wrenching betrayal. Her breath caught in her throat, and she swallowed hard, trying to push down the sob that threatened to rise. She couldn't afford to break down again, not now. Soft footsteps padded down the hallway, and then Jill appeared in the doorway, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. Her eyes were rimmed with red, exhaustion etched on her face, but her expression was firm, resolute. "Hey," Jill said quietly, walking over and handing her the mug. "How are you holding up?" Allison took the coffee, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. She stared into the dark liquid, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know." Jill sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You don't have to know right now. One step at a time." Allison nodded, taking a careful sip. The bitterness of the coffee grounded her, cutting through the fog of confusion in her mind. "The kids are in the kitchen having breakfast. I told them you weren't feeling well," Jill said, her voice softening. She paused, her gaze shifting slightly. "They're worried about you." Guilt twisted in Allison's stomach. "I need to be strong for them." "You are strong," Jill insisted, her tone firm but gentle. "But you don't have to do this alone. Whatever you decide to do about him," Jill added, her words steady and supportive, "I'm here. We'll figure it out." Allison took a shaky breath. "I have no idea what to do, Jill. Part of me wants to pretend he doesn't exist. But another part, a stupid broken part, wonders if there's more to the story. What if he really was trying to protect us?" Jill's jaw tightened, her voice hardening. "Even if that's true, abandoning you and the kids wasn't the way to do it. He made his choice. Now you get to make yours." The weight of Jill's words settled heavily in Allison's chest. She knew Jill was right, but the pressure of making the decision was suffocating. Whatever choice she made, it would shape her future, and Connor's and Mia's. How could she possibly explain any of this to them? The sound of little feet padding toward the living room broke her thoughts. Connor appeared first, his wide brown eyes filled with concern. Mia followed closely behind, clutching her stuffed bunny, her lip trembling. "Mommy, are you okay?" Mia whispered, her voice small and unsure. Allison set the coffee down and opened her arms. Without hesitation, her children rushed to her, their warmth a balm for her raw nerves. She held them tightly, pressing soft kisses to the tops of their heads. "I'm okay, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice cracking despite her efforts to sound calm. "I just needed some rest." Connor pulled back slightly, his gaze searching her face with that familiar, innocent worry. Did something bad happen? The innocence of his question nearly broke her heart. She glanced at Jill, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. "Something unexpected happened," Allison said carefully. "But it's going to be okay. I promise." Mia snuggled closer, her small fingers gripping Allison's shirt. "We love you, Mommy." Allison's throat tightened. "I love you too. More than anything," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jill cleared her throat, breaking the moment with a light-hearted tone. "Hey, who wants pancakes? I make them almost as good as your mom." Mia's face lit up instantly. "Me." Connor managed a small smile. "Okay, but you better not burn them." Jill laughed, the sound light and warm. "No promises." As they disappeared back into the kitchen, Jill shot Allison a pointed look. "Look, we'll talk later." The message was clear. The kids came first, and for now they needed their mother's strength. Allison leaned back, exhaling slowly. Her mind still spun with doubts and fears, but for the moment, the weight on her shoulders felt just a little lighter. Later that afternoon, after Jill had taken the kids to the park to give her some space, Allison found herself pacing the living room. The silence was oppressive, settling like a heavy blanket around her. Tyler's face loomed behind her eyelids, the shock and guilt etched into his features. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from the fog in her mind. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw an unknown number flash on the screen. Her fingers hesitated before she answered. Hello. Allison. The voice was low, cautious, and very much male. Who is this? Her breath caught in her throat. Detective Ramirez. I got your number from Jill. She said you might need some help. A wave of relief washed over her. She sank onto the couch, her knees suddenly weak. Yes, she whispered, her voice cracking. Yes, I do. I know a bit about your situation, the detective continued, his voice steady. If what she says is true, you've got a lot more going on than a missing husband. Sounds like something we should look into. Allison's pulse quickened. You believe me? I've seen enough in my line of work to know that the truth is often stranger than fiction. If Tyler's alive and there's a chance he's involved in something illegal, we need to figure it out. For your safety and your kids. Tears welled in her eyes, a mix of gratitude and fear. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, he replied. This could get complicated. But you're not alone in this, Allison. I promise. As the call ended, a spark of determination ignited inside her. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't alone. For the first time since she'd seen Tyler, a plan began to form in her mind. She would uncover the truth, whatever it took. Allison stared at her phone long after the call with Detective Ramirez had ended, the weight of his words pressing down on her shoulders. This could get complicated. She had no illusions that uncovering the truth about Tyler's disappearance and his new life would be easy. But for the first time in years she felt a flicker of control. She stood and paced the living room, her mind buzzing with questions. Tyler had claimed he was protecting them. But from what? Who were these dangerous people he had mentioned? And why had he come back now at the gala so boldly? The pieces didn't fit, and she was determined to force them together. Her eyes lingered on the family photo on the mantel, the one that had always been her favorite. She picked it up carefully, her fingers tracing Tyler's face. He looked so genuine in that moment. His arm wrapped around her, his smile radiant with promises of a future they were meant to share. But now, with everything she knew, that smile felt like a slap to her face. She set the photo down with a heavy sigh, a spark of anger slowly replacing the lingering despair. She wasn't going to let Tyler's betrayal break her any further. Not today. Not anymore. She owed it to herself, and to her children, to find answers. The knock at the door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. She wiped her hands on her jeans and took a steadying breath before she opened it. Detective Ramirez stood on the other side, his expression calm but serious. In his mid-40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and an air of quiet authority, he had a presence that demanded respect. Allison? He asked. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He walked through the door, his eyes scanning the room with practiced ease. It wasn't intrusive, but he took in everything, the worn furniture, the toys scattered in the corner, the faint scent of cinnamon still lingering from the night before. Thank you for coming, she said, her voice steady despite the nerves that threatened to rise. He nodded, his gaze still sweeping the room. Your sister gave me the broad strokes, but I need to hear it from you. Start from the beginning. Allison gestured to the couch and they both sat. She didn't hesitate, her words tumbled out in a rush. How Tyler had been declared dead 7 years ago, how she had seen him alive at the gala, the confrontation, and his cryptic explanations about a botched deal and dangerous people. Ramirez listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each detail. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This is messy, he said, his tone thoughtful. If he's telling the truth about being involved with dangerous people, there could be more to this than just a man abandoning his family. Allison's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. He still made that choice. He still left us. Ramirez's voice softened but remained firm. I know. But if he's tangled up with criminals, that means you and your kids could be in danger too. A chill ran down her spine. Do you think they know about us? It's hard to say, Ramirez admitted. But we can't take any chances. I'll look into Tyler's disappearance, see if I can find any record of a financial deal gone wrong or connections to known criminals. In the meantime, keep an eye out for anything unusual. People hanging around who shouldn't be. Strange cars. Anything. Allison nodded, her mind spinning with possibilities. What if Tyler tries to contact me again? Let me know immediately, Ramirez said. We need to know what he's up to. Just then, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Allison's heart leapt into her throat. Ramirez's eyes narrowed, and he stood, motioning for her to stay put. He walked to the door and peeked through the peephole before relaxing slightly. "It's your sister," he said. Relief flooded her chest, and Allison hurried to open the door. Jill stood there with Connor and Mia, their cheeks rosy from the cold, clutching half-eaten bags of popcorn. "Hey," Jill said, her gaze flicking over to Ramirez with a quick assessment. "Everything okay?" Allison forced a smile, trying to keep the worry off her face. "Yeah, come in." Connor and Mia darted inside, their chatter filling the room with innocent joy, blissfully unaware of the storm their mother was weathering. Jill followed them in, but her gaze remained sharp, still questioning. "Detective Ramirez is helping us," Allison explained in a low voice, making sure the kids couldn't overhear. Jill nodded, her expression fierce. "Good. We need all the help we can get." Ramirez stood, his presence steady and reassuring. "I'll start digging," he said, his voice calm but purposeful. "Stay safe, Allison. And remember, you're not alone in this." Allison nodded, her throat tight with gratitude. "Thank you." He gave her a reassuring nod and walked toward the door, it clicking softly behind him as he left. Jill turned to face her, hands on her hips. "So what's the next move?" Allison exhaled deeply, the weight of the decision settling over her like a heavy cloak. "We find out what Tyler's hiding. No more lies. No more secrets." Jill's eyes sparkled with approval. "We'll get through this. You've got me. And now you've got Ramirez." Jill's voice was confident. "Tyler doesn't stand a chance." A determined fire ignited in Allison's chest. For far too long, she had been at the mercy of Tyler's choices. Now she was taking back control. She hugged her kids tightly, their warmth a reminder of what truly mattered. No matter how tangled the web of lies became, she would fight her way through it for them. The next few days passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Allison kept her routine steady for the kids, making breakfast, packing lunches, helping with homework, pretending as if her world hadn't just been shattered. But beneath the calm exterior, her mind was a whirlwind. Every time the phone rang or a car slowed near the house, her heart seized with dread. She watched the street with an almost paranoid vigilance, noting every unfamiliar face, every vehicle that lingered just a second too long. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, her mind replaying that moment she saw Tyler at the gala over and over, like a broken record. By the third day, the anxiety was wearing her thin. She sipped coffee in the kitchen, the bitter liquid doing little to clear the fog of exhaustion clouding her thoughts. The morning sun streamed through the window, but it did nothing to lift the dark cloud that hung over her. Her phone buzzed on the counter, making her jump. She snatched it up, her fingers trembling. A text from Detective Ramirez flashed on the screen. "Meet me at the station in an hour. I found something." Her stomach flipped. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. She glanced at the clock. Connor and Mia were at school, and Jill had offered to pick them up later. She had time. Grabbing her coat and keys, she left the house, her mind racing with possibilities. The police station was a squat, gray building that looked as tired as she felt. Allison stepped inside, the hum of fluorescent lights and the low murmur of voices making her feel disoriented. She spotted Ramirez near the front desk. He waved her over, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for coming," he said, his tone clipped. "Come with me." He led her to a small windowless office. The walls were lined with case files, and a single desk lamp cast long shadows across the room. He gestured for her to sit, then closed the door behind them. "I found something about Tyler," he said, sitting down across from her. His eyes were sharp, his demeanor serious. "And it's not good." Her mouth went dry. "What is it?" He slid a folder toward her. A few months before his death, Tyler was involved with a man named Vincent Marks. Marks is a financier on paper. Off the record, he launders money for some very dangerous people, drug traffickers, arms dealers, you name it. Allison's hand shook as she opened the folder. A black and white photo of a man stared back at her. Slicked back hair, cold, predatory eyes. Her stomach churned as she absorbed the details. Tyler was part of a deal that went sideways. Ramirez continued, his tone measured but tense. He was supposed to help Marks move a large sum of money, but it disappeared when it did. Tyler vanished too. Allison swallowed hard, her thoughts a whirlwind. And Marks? What happened to him? Ramirez's jaw tightened, his voice low. He's still out there and he doesn't like being played. If he finds out Tyler's alive, the implication is clear. Marks wouldn't just come for Tyler. He'd come for anyone connected to him, including you and the kids. Panic surged through her veins, cold and terrifying. We're in danger, aren't we? Ramirez's eyes softened, his expression sympathetic but firm. We don't know for sure, but we need to be careful. I've put a patrol on your street, and I'll be checking in regularly. You're not alone in this, Allison. She nodded, her breath shallow as her mind raced. Her thoughts darted immediately to Connor and Mia, their innocent faces so unaware of the danger surrounding them. What do I do now? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Ramirez leaned forward, his tone resolute. For now, you go home and stick to your routine. Don't let the kids know anything's wrong. I'll keep digging. If Tyler contacts you again, let me know immediately. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. Okay. He stood, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. We're going to figure this out. I promise. She wanted to believe him, but fear gnawed at her insides. The world she had worked so hard to build for her children felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. The drive home was a blur. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. Every car that followed her felt like a threat. Every pedestrian a potential enemy. By the time she parked in front of her house, she was trembling. She sat in the car for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The street was quiet, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. A patrol car, Ramirez's team, was parked a few houses down. It provided a small measure of comfort, but it wasn't enough to chase away the fear that had settled deep within her. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. As she walked up the steps, she noticed something unusual. The mail, usually stuffed into the mailbox, was scattered across the porch. Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly scanned the area, her eyes darting to the bushes and the street beyond. Stay calm, she told herself. Bending down, she gathered the mail, her hands trembling. That's when she saw it. A single unmarked envelope, stark white against the rest. Her stomach twisted as she picked it up, her fingers shaking as she tore it open. A single sheet of paper slid out. The message was typed in bold black letters. You can't hide the truth forever. A cold chill ran down her spine. Her head snapped up. She spun around, scanning the street, the houses, the windows. Everything looked the same, but she felt eyes on her, watching, waiting. Her heart hammered in her chest as she hurried inside, locking the door behind her. She leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The web of lies was tightening around her, and whoever was behind it was closing in. Allison's fingers clenched the envelope so tightly it crumpled in her hand. The words burned into her mind. You can't hide the truth forever. The house felt too quiet. The walls seemed to close in around her. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to think. She needed to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. Glancing out the window, she saw the patrol car still parked a few houses down. Ramirez's team was watching, but the note had still made its way to her doorstep. Whoever left it was either bold or desperate, maybe both. She grabbed her phone and called Ramirez. He picked up on the second ring. Allison. His voice was sharp, alert. There was a note, she said, her voice trembling. Someone left a note on my porch. Silence. Then he spoke, his tone serious. What does it say? She read the message aloud, her hands still shaking. It was typed. No name, no address. Just those words. I'm on my way, he replied, his voice firm. Don't open the door for anyone. Stay with the kids. Keep the curtains closed. She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Okay. She hung up and took a steadying breath. Her eyes drifted toward the clock on the wall. Joe would be bringing Connor and Mia home any minute, and the thought of them walking into this nightmare made her stomach churn. The sound of tires crunching on gravel outside made her jump. She peeked through the curtain, exhaling shakily. It was Jill's car. Allison rushed to the door and opened it just as Jill stepped out with the kids, their cheeks rosy from the cold, both clutching half-eaten bags of popcorn. Hey, Jill called cheerfully, holding Mia's hand while Connor swung his backpack over his shoulder. We're back. Allison forced a smile, her heart pounding. Come inside quick. Jill's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing with concern. What's wrong? Just get in, Allison urged. I'll explain. Jill's expression turned serious, but she didn't argue. She herded the kids inside, and Allison quickly shut the door, locking it behind them. Mom! Connor called, his face lighting up. Guess what? I got an A on my science quiz. That's wonderful, sweetheart, she said, her voice tight. She kissed the top of his head, trying to mask the fear clawing at her chest. Why don't you two go play in your room for a bit? I need to talk to Aunt Jill. Connor's brow furrowed. Are you okay, Mom? She smiled weakly. I'm fine. I just need a minute. Okay, he said, grabbing Mia's hand, and they disappeared down the hallway. As soon as they were out of earshot, Jill turned to her. What the hell is going on? Allison handed her the crumpled envelope. Jill's face went pale as she read the note. This was on your porch? She asked, her voice shaking. Allison nodded. Ramirez is on his way. Jill's eyes blazed with fury. Someone's threatening you. Do you think it's Tyler? I don't know, Allison whispered, her voice breaking. But whoever it is, they know something, and they're not going to stop. Before Jill could respond, there was a firm knock at the door. Allison's heart leapt into her throat. Jill stepped protectively in front of her, her jaw tight. It's Ramirez. A voice called from the other side of the door. Open up, it's me. Jill exhaled sharply and opened the door. Detective Ramirez walked in, his expression grim. 2 uniformed officers followed him, their eyes scanning the room with trained precision. Where's the note? Ramirez asked. Allison handed it over, her fingers still trembling. He examined it carefully, his brow furrowed. Whoever left this wanted you to feel vulnerable. They wanted you to know they're watching. Allison swallowed hard. Does this mean they know about the kids? Ramirez's jaw clenched. We can't rule it out, but we're going to increase patrols in the area. I'll have someone stationed outside your house 24/7. Jill crossed her arms, her face flushed with anger. This isn't enough, she said, her voice sharp with frustration. What if they break in? What if they take the kids? We can't just sit here waiting. Ramirez's gaze softened slightly, but his words were still firm. I understand your fear, but right now we don't have enough evidence to escalate things further. The best thing you can do is stay vigilant. Keep the doors locked, don't go anywhere alone, and call me if anything feels off. Allison nodded, her chest tight, trying to keep her panic at bay. What about Tyler? Should I go looking for him? Ramirez shook his head, the warning clear in his eyes. No. Let me handle that. Whoever is after him is dangerous. If they think you're looking for him, it could put you and the kids in more danger. She clenched her jaw, frustration bubbling up again. So I just wait? That's all I can do. Yes, he replied gently, but there was a steel edge to his words. But you're not powerless. You've gotten this far because you're strong. Keep doing what you're doing. We'll get through this. His attempt to reassure her only seemed to tighten the knot in her chest. She watched as the officers continued their sweep of the house, checking every window and door before setting up their post outside. By the time they left, the house felt simultaneously safer and more suffocating. The silence inside was heavy, the curtains drawn tight, the doors locked. But the air felt thick with uncertainty, every creak of the house, every gust of wind, a reminder of how fragile their safety was. Jill turned to her, her eyes burning with resolve. You're not alone in this. I'm staying here. We'll protect the kids no matter what. Allison nodded, her eyes brimming with tears she couldn't allow to fall. Thank you. Jill hugged her tightly. We've gotten through worse. We'll get through this too. As they pulled apart, Allison's phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen, her breath catching. An unknown number. Her heart raced as she hesitated before answering. Hello. A distorted voice crackled through the line, cold and threatening. Stop digging, Allison. Or you'll regret it. The line went dead. Allison stared at the phone, her hands trembling as the finality of the threat sank in. The walls were closing in. Her hand shook violently as she set the phone down. the words still echoing in her mind. Stop digging or you'll regret it. The chilling coldness of the warning wrapped around her like a vice, tightening with each breath. She tried to steady herself, but it was hard to breathe, as though the very air was too thin. Jill's eyes narrowed, instinctively sensing something was off. Who was that? What did they say? Allison swallowed hard, the words heavy on her tongue. They told me to stop digging. Or I'd regret it. Jill's face went pale, but her expression steeled. You need to tell Ramirez. Now. Allison nodded, but her mind raced. I will. But what if telling him makes things worse? What if they come after us harder? Jill's voice rose with urgency. They're already threatening you. They know where you live. We can't wait around for them to make the next move. Allison felt the weight of her sister's words, the storm of fear and uncertainty threatening to break her. I can't put the kids in danger, Jill. Not because of Tyler's mess. Jill clenched her fists, her voice firm. Then what's the alternative? Hiding, waiting for them to decide when they're going to act? We can't sit back while they threaten us. Allison closed her eyes, every possible outcome running through her mind. Each decision felt like stepping on thin ice. One wrong move and everything could crumble. Her thoughts flickered to Connor and Mia, still blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding them. For now she thought they're safe. A sharp knock at the door startled them both. Jill moved quickly to the window, her eyes narrowing as she peered through the curtains. It's Ramirez, she said, relief and tension battling in her voice. Allison took a shaky breath and opened the door. Ramirez stepped inside, his face tense. His eyes scanned the room immediately, noticing the subtle shift in the atmosphere. What happened? He asked quietly, his voice low and steady. Allison held out the phone. I got a call, she said, her voice unsteady. They told me to stop digging or else. Ramirez's jaw tightened as he took the phone, examining the block number on the screen. They're covering their tracks, he muttered. His eyes met hers, his expression hardening. This changes things. They're getting bolder. Allison's legs felt weak. She sank onto the couch, her fingers gripping the armrest like it was the only thing holding her upright. What do we do now? She whispered, her voice fragile. Ramirez knelt in front of her, his tone firm but calming. We're not backing down. But we have to be smart. I'm going to have someone analyze the call and see if we can trace it. I'm also putting a team on you and the kids around the clock. You won't be alone for a second. Jill crossed her arms, her eyes sharp. What about Tyler? He's the reason all this is happening. Can't you find him and use him to stop this? Ramirez's face darkened. We're trying. But Tyler knows how to disappear. He's been doing it for years. If he doesn't want to be found, it'll take time. Allison's voice cracked. And we don't have time. Ramirez knelt closer, his voice softening, his eyes filled with understanding. I know you're scared, but I promise you we'll keep you and the kids safe. I won't let anything happen to you. A tear slid down Allison's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, frustrated with herself. I just want this to be over. We'll get there, Ramirez reassured her, his voice steady. One step at a time. Later that night, after the kids were in bed and Jill had fallen asleep on the couch, Allison sat at the kitchen table, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the walls. Her mind churned with fear and exhaustion. She thought about Tyler, the man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her heart and their children's future. The man who had shattered that trust, leaving her to pick up the pieces. A part of her still wanted to believe there was a reason, some justification for what he had done. But the truth was far more brutal. His choices had led them here, and now she had to face the consequences. A soft creak of a floorboard behind her made her jump. She turned quickly, her heart racing. Connor stood in the doorway, his eyes wide and sleepy. Mom! She forced a smile, pushing down the fear. Hey buddy, what are you doing up? He shuffled over silently, his bare feet barely making a sound on the cold floor. I had a bad dream. Her heart ached as she scooped him up into her arms, holding him close. It's okay. You're safe. He buried his face in her shoulder, his voice small. I dreamed someone was chasing us. Her throat tightened as she whispered. No one's going to hurt us. I promise. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. You're scared too, aren't you? She hesitated, the weight of the truth heavy in her chest. Yeah, a little. But being scared doesn't mean we aren't strong. And we're going to get through this together. Connor nodded, his small hands gripping her shirt tightly. I trust you, Mom. Her eyes filled with tears again, but she smiled, kissing his forehead. I love you, buddy. I love you too. She held him until his breathing slowed, his little body relaxing in her arms. She carried him back to his bed and tucked him in gently, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead before quietly closing the door. With a heavy heart she made a vow to herself. No matter what, she would protect them. She would face whatever darkness came their way. And if that meant confronting the chaos Tyler had unleashed, then so be it. The coffee in Allison's hands had gone lukewarm, forgotten as she stared at the front door. Her nerves were taut, like frayed wires on the verge of snapping. She expected it to burst open any moment. The quiet of the house felt stifling, oppressive. Jill entered the kitchen, her hair tangled and eyes heavy with worry. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, her gaze never leaving Allison. Did you sleep at all? Jill asked softly. Allison shook her head. Couldn't. Every noise feels like a threat. Jill sighed, her frustration palpable. This isn't sustainable, Allison. You can't keep going like this. It's going to break you. Allison's jaw tightened. I don't have a choice. If I break, what happens to Connor and Mia? Jill's eyes softened, but she didn't back down. You don't have to carry this alone. Ramirez is doing everything he can. Let him help. Allison stared into her coffee, her reflection distorting in the dark liquid. It's not enough, Jill. They're getting closer. I can feel it. Before Jill could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Both women froze. The air seemed to thicken, trapping them in place. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Allison, it's Ramirez. A rush of relief flooded through her, so powerful that it almost made her legs give out. She sprang up and rushed to the door, flinging it open. Detective Ramirez stood on the porch, his face grim, a manila folder clutched tightly in his hand. Can I come in? He asked, his voice low. Allison stepped aside to let him in. He entered quickly, his eyes scanning the room with practiced precision before landing on her. We need to talk. They sat at the kitchen table. Jill hovered nearby, arms crossed, her stance defensive. Ramirez slid the folder toward Allison, his movements deliberate. We traced the call you got, he began. It was rerouted through several networks, but we managed to track it to a burner phone. The location pinged near a warehouse district downtown. Allison's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her pulse quickening. Do you think it's Tyler? Ramirez hesitated, his jaw working as he considered the question. Maybe. Or it could be someone connected to him. Either way, it's a lead. A flicker of hope sparked in her chest. So we can find out who's behind this? Ramirez nodded slowly. We're going to try. But I need you to stay put. It's too dangerous for you to get involved. Allison's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. I can't just sit here and do nothing. You have to, Ramirez said, his voice firm but compassionate. Your job is to protect your kids. Let us handle the rest. Before she could argue, her phone buzzed on the table. Her heart leapt into her throat. Another blocked number. Ramirez's eyes narrowed, and he gestured for her to answer. Allison took a deep breath, steadying herself before pressing the call button. Hello. A distorted voice crackled through the line, cold, calculated, unmistakably male. You didn't listen, Allison. Her blood ran cold. Who is this? You had your chance to walk away, the voice continued, a chilling finality in its tone. Now it's too late. The line went dead. Her hands shook as she lowered the phone. Ramirez grabbed it from her, his face hard with fury. We'll trace it. Don't worry. But worry was all Allison could do. The threat hung in the air, suffocating, growing tighter with every second. What do they want? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Ramirez stood, his shoulders tense with barely controlled anger. They want to scare you. And it's working. Jill stepped forward, her voice rising with panic. You need to get out of here. Take the kids somewhere safe. Allison shook her head, her breath shallow. We can't run. They'll find us no matter where we go. The only way to end this is to face it. Jill's eyes widened in disbelief. Are you serious? You want to face them? Allison's voice was low but steady. I don't want to. But what choice do we have? If we run, we'll be looking over our shoulders forever. I can't live like that. The kids can't live like that. Ramirez nodded reluctantly, his tone softer but still resolute. You're right. But we do this my way. You stay here with an officer on guard. I'll check out the warehouse. If Tyler's there, we'll bring him in. Allison's stomach twisted at the thought of Tyler being so close, yet so out of reach. What if it's not Tyler? Then we deal with whoever it is, Ramirez said. And we end this. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Allison called out, her voice trembling. Ramirez. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. Be careful, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. He gave her a grim smile before exiting, the door clicking softly behind him. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest like a vice. Jill placed a hand on her shoulder, her touch steady and reassuring. You're doing the right thing. Allison nodded, but doubt gnawed at her. Every choice felt like a gamble, and the stakes were her children's lives. She closed her eyes, trying to steady the storm inside her. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity as the clock ticked loudly in the silence. She thought of Connor and Maya, playing in their room, blissfully unaware of the danger closing in. Her phone buzzed again, making her jump. The screen flashed with another text from a blocked number. This time the words hit her like a punch to the gut. I warned you, Allison. Now you'll pay the price. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands cold and clammy. She rushed to the window, her eyes scanning the street. The patrol car was still parked a few houses down, but the unease in her gut twisted into dread. Something wasn't right. Then a loud crash echoed from the kids' room. Mom! Connor screamed. Allison's heart stopped. She bolted down the hallway, Jill close behind her. The door to the kids' room was wide open, the window shattered, cold air rushing in. Connor stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror. Maya was gone. No! Allison screamed, her voice raw and desperate as she stumbled into the room. Her eyes darted around, panic rising in her chest. Shards of glass glittered on the floor, the room icy with the wind pouring through the broken window. Connor stood there, his face pale, his eyes locked on the empty space where Maya had just been. Mom! He whispered, his voice shaking. They took her. They took Maya. Allison dropped to her knees, grabbing Connor's shoulders, her fingers trembling. Did you see them? Did you see who took her? He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. There was a man. He broke the window. He grabbed her and climbed out. A wave of nausea crashed over Allison, her vision blurred with panic. She pulled Connor into her arms, her heart hammering. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. Jill burst into the room, her eyes wild. What happened? Oh my God. Where's Maya? They took her. Allison choked out, her voice barely a whisper. They took my baby. Jill's face contorted with a mix of rage and fear. We have to call Ramirez. Allison's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone. She pressed the number with trembling fingers. The call connected immediately. Allison. Ramirez's voice was tense, urgent. What's happening? They took her, she sobbed. They broke into the house and took her. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. We're on our way. Stay calm. Lock the doors and don't let anyone in. We'll find her. She hung up, her head spinning. Stay calm, the words echoing in her mind like a cruel joke. How could she stay calm when her daughter was out there, alone and terrified? Jill grabbed her arm, her grip firm. We're not letting them take her. We'll find her. We'll get her back. Allison Ramirez will find her. But what if it's already too late? The thought clouded her mind, heavy and suffocating. A dark fear took root, relentless and overwhelming. She wiped her face, trying to regain control. She couldn't fall apart now. Maya needed her strength. Connor clung to her, his tiny body trembling. It's never going to be okay, he whispered. Allison pressed a kiss to his forehead, her voice shaky but determined. Yes, baby. We're going to bring her home. Her mind raced through every possible scenario. Tyler. The threats, the mysterious figures lurking just out of reach. It all pointed back to him. Whoever had taken Mia was tied to Tyler's past, and the only way to save her daughter was to face that past head-on. Waiting for Ramirez wasn't an option. She had to act now. 15 minutes later, Allison stood outside the warehouse district. Ramirez had told her that Jill insisted on coming along, and Connor had been left with the officer stationed at their house. The cold wind cut through the deserted streets, carrying the smell of rust and decay. The abandoned buildings stood around them, windows shattered, walls splattered with graffiti. "This is insane," Jill whispered, her eyes scanning the shadows. "We should be waiting for the police." "They'll be here soon," Allison said, her jaw clenched. "But I can't wait." "I won't." She tightened her grip on the note in her hand, the last threat she'd received. The words were seared into her memory. "You can't hide the truth forever." Whoever had sent it thought fear would stop her, thought it would keep her from fighting back. They were wrong. She moved quietly, each step echoing off the cracked pavement. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every sound magnified. Her heart pounded, adrenaline surging through her. She couldn't afford to let fear take over. Mia's life depended on it. Jill stayed close behind her. "How do we even know where to look?" Jill asked, her voice low. Allison's eyes darted over the buildings. One stood out, a dilapidated structure with a chain-link fence that had been partly torn down. Its windows were dark, but something about it felt wrong, a chill creeping down her spine. "That one," she whispered, pointing. Jill's face went pale, but she nodded. "Let's go." They slipped through the gap in the fence, the metal rattling quietly. Allison's breath was quick, her palms sweating as she wiped them on her jeans. She forced herself to stay focused. As they neared the building, a faint sound reached her ears. A muffled cry. "Mia!" Her heart clenched. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward the sound, Jill following right behind her. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it. Allison pushed it open, her breath catching in her throat as she stepped inside. The air was cold and stale, and the floor was littered with debris. "Mommy!" Mia's terrified voice broke the silence. Allison's eyes frantically scanned the shadows until they landed on a man holding Mia tightly, a hand pressed over her mouth. Her daughter's wide, terrified eyes met hers, her small body shaking. "Let her go!" Allison's voice trembled with anger. The man stepped forward, revealing his cruel face, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You shouldn't have come, Allison." "Let her go," Allison repeated, her voice growing stronger. "Take me instead. Just let her go." He laughed, the sound echoing hollowly in the space. "It's too late for bargaining." Allison's heart raced as her mind scrambled for a solution. She had no weapon, no plan, but she had to act. Then suddenly a shout rang out from outside. Flashlights pierced the darkness, beams cutting through the shadows. "Police! Drop your weapon!" The man's eyes widened in panic as he shoved Mia away and bolted for the back door. Allison lunged forward, catching Mia in her arms and holding her close, feeling her daughter's heartbeat against her chest. "Maya, baby, I've got you. I've got you," she sobbed. Jill grabbed them both, her arms trembling. Ramirez stormed in, gun drawn, his expression fierce. "Are you okay?" he demanded. Allison nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We're okay. We're okay." The sound of sirens filled the air. But in that moment, all Allison could hear was the steady rhythm of Maya's heartbeat. For now, that was enough. Allison's hands shook as she held Maya tightly to her chest. Her daughter's tiny fingers clung to her shirt, her sobs muffled against her shoulder. The chaos around them, the flashing lights, the shouting officers, faded into the background. Nothing mattered but the warmth of Maya's body, the steady beat of her heart against her own. Ramirez's voice cut through the fog. "We need to get you both out of here. It's not safe yet." Jill nodded, her face pale but resolute. "Come on, let's go." Allison followed them out into the night, her legs weak beneath her. The cold air hit her like a slap, but it couldn't clear the fog of fear and adrenaline clouding her mind. She stumbled toward one of the police cruisers, Ramirez holding the door open. "Get in," he urged. She slid into the back seat, still holding Maya close. Jill climbed in beside her, slamming the door shut behind her. The warmth of the car's interior was a sharp contrast to the icy dread gnawing at her insides. Ramirez leaned in through the window, his face drawn with exhaustion. We're taking you to a safe house, he said. You'll stay there until we figure out who's behind this. Allison clenched her jaw. It's Tyler. It has to be. He's the one behind all of this. Ramirez nodded. Maybe. But we need proof. Until we have it, you need to stay off the radar. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. I can't keep running, Ramirez. I need to end this. We will end it, he said firmly. But you can't do it alone. Allison met his gaze, feeling the weight of the past 7 years pressing down on her. I'm tired of feeling powerless. He gave her a grim smile. That's exactly why we're going to stop this. Trust me. She nodded, brushing her fingers through Maya's hair as her daughter's breathing began to slow. The exhaustion was finally catching up with her. Her body screamed for rest, even as her mind raced, demanding answers. Jill draped an arm over her shoulders, her voice gentle. We'll figure it out, Allie. One way or another. The safe house they arrived at was a modest bungalow, tucked away in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood. Ramirez led them inside, and closed the door with a definitive click. Inside, the living room was sparsely furnished, just a couch, a coffee table, and heavy curtains drawn tight over the windows. It was secure, but it felt suffocating like a cage. You're safe here, Ramirez said, his voice quiet but reassuring. There's an officer stationed outside. No one gets in or out without my say-so. Allison nodded, the weight in her chest growing heavier with each passing second. Thank you. I'll be in touch, Ramirez promised. Rest if you can. The sound of the door locking behind him was the only noise in the stillness. Jill turned to Allison, her face lined with concern. You should get some sleep, she said softly. I'll stay up and keep watch. Allison shook her head. I can't. Not until I know Mia's okay. Jill sighed, her expression full of understanding. She's strong just like her mom. She'll be okay. Allison knelt beside the couch, where Mia was curled up under a blanket, her thumb gently tucked into her mouth. Reaching out, she brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. A fierce surge of love and protectiveness washed over her, mingled with the simmering anger that had been building inside. This has to end. Hours passed, and after Jill had finally convinced her to lie down, Allison slipped into a restless sleep. Her mind spun with disjointed images. Tyler's face at the gala, the shattered window, Mia's terrified eyes. A voice rang out through the chaos, cold and menacing. Stop digging, Allison, or you'll regret it. She jolted awake, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was dark, a faint glow seeping through the curtains. She glanced at the clock, 3:27 a.m. The silence pressed in on her, suffocating, as if the world itself had stopped. She swung her legs off the couch, standing slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion. Jill was asleep in the armchair, her head resting on her hand. Allison tiptoed to the kitchen, seeking something to anchor her. As she poured a glass of water, her phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a blocked number. Her breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, but her hand trembled as she picked it up. Allison. The voice was distorted, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was Tyler. Her voice barely a whisper. She spoke. I didn't want this. I never wanted you or the kid to get hurt. Then stop it, she hissed, her anger flaring. Stop this madness before it's too late. It's out of my hands now, Tyler replied, his voice cracking. I made mistakes, Allison. I thought I could fix them, but they're closing in on me too. Where are you? She demanded. Tell me where you are, and we can end this together. A long silence stretched between them. She could hear his ragged breathing, feel his hesitation. I'm sorry, he whispered. But you need to stop looking for me. They'll never stop if you don't. Who are they? She begged, her voice desperate. Tyler, please. But the line went dead. Allison stared at the phone, her body shaking. Anger, frustration, and bitterness flooded through her. He's running again, leaving me to clean up the mess, she thought. But she was done waiting. Her eyes blazed with determination as she turned to Jill, who had woken up and was watching her carefully. What happened? Jill asked, her voice tight with concern. Allison's voice was cold and hard as she spoke. I'm going to find him. And this time, I'm not stopping until I do. Jill's eyes widened. Allie, you can't. I have to, Allison said, her voice unwavering. For Mia. For Connor. For all of us. The trap was closing in, but she was done being the prey. Every beat of her heart solidified her resolve. Fear had been her constant companion for too long, but not anymore. She glanced at Jill, whose face was filled with worry. "Allie, think this through," Jill said, her voice low. "You can't just go out there and find him. Ramirez said it's dangerous." "I don't care," Allison snapped, the fury in her voice surprising even her. "He called me. He knows where we are. As long as he's out there, we're never going to be safe." Jill's shoulders sagged, her eyes glistening with unspoken tears. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." Allison shook her head. "I have to do this, Jill. I can't live like this anymore. I need answers." Before Jill could protest, the door creaked open and Detective Ramirez stepped inside, his face grim, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You're awake," he said, glancing between the two women. "We've got a lead." Allison's breath caught in her throat. She could tell something was coming, but Ramirez hesitated before continuing. "We traced the burner phone to an abandoned hotel downtown. We think Tyler's holed up there." A chill ran down her spine. "Then that's where I'm going?" Ramirez's jaw tightened. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. We'll handle it." Allison stepped forward, her eyes burning with resolve. "I need to be there. I need to face him. He's the reason all of this is happening. He owes me the truth." Ramirez studied her for a long, silent moment before sighing. "You won't back down, will you?" "No." He nodded reluctantly. "All right. But you stay close to me. No heroics." Jill grabbed Allison's hand. "Be careful." Allison squeezed her sister's fingers. "I will." The ride to the hotel was silent, the tension in the car thick enough to cut through. The city outside blurred past in a whirl of neon lights and shadowy alleyways, the first light of dawn beginning to glow in the sky. The hotel loomed ahead, its once grand exterior crumbling, the windows dark and empty. The faded sign hung crookedly, its letters chipped and peeling. The building itself seemed to exhale despair. Ramirez parked the car a block away, scanning the area cautiously. "Stay behind me. We don't know what we're walking into." Allison nodded, her fists clenched at her sides. The wind cut through her coat, but she barely noticed. Every fiber of her being was focused on the task ahead. They moved toward the entrance, their footsteps muffled by the debris scattered on the sidewalk. Ramirez drew his gun, his body tense. The door stood slightly ajar, hanging off one hinge. With a slow, deliberate movement, he pushed it open with the barrel of his gun. The creak echoed through the empty lobby. Inside, the air was thick with dust and neglect, the peeling wallpaper curling away from the walls like dead leaves. Broken furniture lay strewn across the floor. "Stay close," Ramirez murmured. Allison obeyed, her breath shallow. Every shadow seemed to pulse with life, every sound a potential threat. They moved down a hallway, the cracked doors on either side barely holding together. The dim light filtering through shattered windows cast strange, eerie patterns on the walls. A faint noise stopped them in their tracks, a creaking floorboard barely audible. Ramirez raised a hand, signaling for her to halt. He edged forward, peering around the corner. Allison's heart leaped into her throat when she heard his voice, low and commanding. "Freeze. Don't move." Allison stepped forward and saw him. Tyler. He was standing at the end of the hallway, his hands raised in surrender, his face gaunt and haunted. He looked older, his features drawn, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes sunken and empty. "Allison," he whispered, his voice breaking. Rage bubbled up in Allison, drowning out the fear. "How could you?" she hissed. "How could you put us through this?" Tyler swallowed hard, his gaze flicking briefly to Ramirez. "I didn't have a choice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Bullshit," Allison shot back, her voice trembling with fury. "You always had a choice and you chose to leave us." His face contorted in pain. "I was trying to protect you. Protect us." Her laughter was bitter and sharp. "You call this protection? Mia was kidnapped because of you." He flinched as though she had struck him. "I didn't know it would get this far. I thought if I stayed away, they'd leave you alone." "Well, you thought wrong," Ramirez snapped. "You've put your entire family in danger." Tyler's shoulders sagged. "I know, and I'm sorry, but it's too late for apologies." Allison took a shaky breath. tears welling in her eyes. Why did you call me, Tyler? Why now? He looked at her, his eyes full of regret. Because I can't run anymore. They're closing in on me. I didn't want you to get caught in the crossfire. Who are they? Ramirez pressed, his eyes narrowing. Tyler's face hardened with fear. Vincent Marks and his men. They know I took the money. They want revenge. Ramirez's jaw tightened. Where's the money now? Tyler shook his head. Gone. I spent years hiding it, trying to buy time, but it wasn't enough. A sudden noise echoed through the building, fast, heavy footsteps. Tyler's eyes widened in panic. They're here. Ramirez spun on his heels. We need to move now. Gunshots rang out, the sound deafening in the narrow hallway. Tyler grabbed Allison's arm, pulling her behind him as they sprinted toward the back exit. Ramirez returned fire, his jaw clenched with determination. Allison, go, he shouted. They burst through the exit door, the cold night air slamming into them like a wall. Tires squealed in the distance as more shots rang out. Tyler stumbled, gasping for breath. Keep going, he urged. Don't stop. But Allison knew with a certainty that time was running out. The icy air bit at her lungs as she ran, her fingers clutching Tyler's wrist. Behind them, the crack of gunfire and Ramirez's shouts echoed, slicing through her nerves like a blade. Her legs felt like lead, but fear pushed her forward. Keep running. Tyler gasped, his breath ragged. They rounded a corner, feet skidding on loose gravel, and found a rusty chain-link fence ahead. A dead end. Allison's heart sank. She spun around, her chest heaving with panic. We're trapped, she cried. Tyler scanned the alley, his eyes frantic. They landed on a metal door set into a brick wall, paint peeling around the edges. He lunged for it, yanking the handle. It didn't budge. It's locked, he muttered, desperation in his voice. The heavy thud of footsteps drew nearer, their pursuers closing in. Ramirez's voice carried from behind them. Allison, hold on. Tyler looked at Allison, his face pale with fear and regret. Her teeth clenched, the weight of everything they had endured crashing down on her. This has to end now, she said, her voice steady despite the terror racing through her veins. We can't keep running. They'll find us. Tyler turned to her, his eyes hollow. I'm so sorry, Allison. I never wanted this. His words sparked something inside her. She stepped forward, voice icy. Sorry won't protect our children. Sorry won't fix what you've broken. Tears shimmered in his eyes. I know. Then do something, she hissed. Stop running. Face them. A tremor ran through his body. For a moment it seemed like he might collapse under the weight of his choices, but then something changed in his expression. A steely resolve she hadn't seen in years. He nodded. Okay, he whispered. I'll end this. The footsteps grew louder. The alley seemed to close in on them. Tyler took a deep breath, squared his shoulders. He turned to Allison, his eyes softening. Take cover. I won't let them hurt you. No, she said fiercely. We do this together. Before he could protest, Ramirez burst into the alley, his gun drawn, eyes flashing with urgency. Get down. Allison dropped to the ground just as gunfire exploded, bullets whizzing overhead, sparks flying off the metal fence. Tyler dove beside her, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Stay low. Ramirez shouted. More figures stormed into the alley, Vincent Marks's men, their eyes cold, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Allison's heart pounded, but she refused to let fear take control. She grabbed a piece of broken brick, her knuckles white. One of Marks's men stepped forward, his gun trained on Tyler. You really thought you could get away with it, Brooks? He sneered. Tyler's jaw clenched. It's over, Marks. Let them go. I'll give you what you want. Vincent Marks stepped from the shadows, a twisted grin on his face. He was impeccably dressed, his cold eyes glinting with malice. You always were a disappointment, Tyler, he drawled. You stole from me, and now you think you can bargain? Pathetic. Tyler stood slowly, his hands raised. I'll come with you. Just leave my family out of it. Marks laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. Oh, you don't get to make demands. I want to see you suffer. And what better way than to take away everything you love? No. Allison shouted, standing despite the fear that clawed at her chest. You're not taking anything else from us. Marx's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing. You're brave. Stupid but brave. In that split second Ramirez moved. He fired a shot, hitting one of Marx's men square in the shoulder. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the alley, the sound deafening. Allison ducked, grabbing Tyler's arm and yanking him behind a dumpster for cover. We have to help Ramirez, she gasped. Tyler nodded, his face grim. He snatched a metal pipe from the ground, gripping it with white-knuckled fists. Stay close. They moved together, adrenaline surging through Allison's veins. Tyler swung the pipe, knocking a gun from one of Marx's men. Ramirez tackled another, bringing him to the ground. Marx's eyes blazed with fury as he aimed his gun at Tyler, his hand steady. This ends now. Time seemed to slow. Without thinking, Allison lunged forward, slamming into Marx's arm. The gun went off, the shot ringing through the alley. Pain seared through her side, but she didn't stop. She clawed at Marx. Her vision blurred. Tyler roared, wrenching the gun from Marx's hand and tossing it aside. He pinned Marx to the ground, chest heaving. For a moment, Allison saw the urge to finish it flash in his eyes. But then he looked at her, saw the fear and pain in her face. Don't, she whispered, her voice trembling. Don't become like him. Tyler's hand shook, his breath ragged. Finally, he released Marx, his shoulders sagging. Ramirez rushed forward, slapping handcuffs on Marx and hauling him to his feet. It's over, Ramirez said, his voice hard. Tyler turned to Allison, his eyes brimming with tears. Are you okay? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. We're finally free. Tyler collapsed to his knees, his face crumpling. I'm so sorry. Allison looked at him, the man who had caused so much pain. Forgiveness wasn't simple, but for the first time it felt possible. It's time to face the consequences, she said. Ramirez nodded. He will. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Allison felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The nightmare was over. She was free to rebuild, to heal. And this time she wasn't afraid.